Okay, guys, we have officially reached the end of term. So this is the first in a series of sort of videos, sort of ending class. Um, this video is the end of class for my one of the ending videos. If you took my Shakespeare class, or my which is English 373, or English 250, where we read Hamlet, or my 201 class. I read Shakespeare in three of my classes this semester. My official Shakespeare class read Macbeth and Coriolanus and Romeo and Juliet and the Phoenix and the Turtle. My introduction to literature class read The Tempest and Othello, and my introduction to literary studies class read Hamlet. So for people that did Shakespeare with me this semester, I wanted to end by reading a short story. The short story is by a writer named Borges. And Borges, by the way, has some great short stories. I highly recommend him if you like this particular story, although this is not necessarily even one of his best ones. But he wrote a great short story called Plan Uqbar Orbis Tetrius, which is a weird story about a guy who invents a fictional world, and the fictional world starts invading our world. It's great. Um, and he also has a story called The Library of Babel that just sort of about a library just goes on forever. And it has just an infinite number of books, which means somewhere in that library is the true story of your death, because it has every combination of all the letters in it. Anyway, he's an interesting guy. And he wrote this story. Now, one of the jokes of the story that's not going to work at all is that he doesn't actually say who the story is about until the very last sentence. But given that it's a Shakespeare class, you probably figured out the person he's writing about is Shakespeare, and you'll figure that out as you go. But he doesn't actually say the name. The title of the story is Everything and Nothing. It's called Everything and Nothing. That's a famous thing that Keats said about Shakespeare, which is that there's something about Shakespeare that's very strange. It feels like somehow it's about everything and nothing. That Shakespeare contains everything and nothing, but somehow he wrote this insane number of plays that seem to be about so many things that it feels like Shakespeare is everything. At the same time, what we know about Shakespeare's life is doesn't seem like he was that interesting of a person. He was just some regular guy. He was just some nobody. So the story is called Everything and Nothing because these are the things that we find in Shakespeare. So I'm going to read this short story, and let's take a look at it. All right. Everything and Nothings by Borges, B-O-R-G-O. Here's his name. Jorge Luis Borges is the name of the short story writer. It's a very short story, by the way. Everything and Nothing. There was no one inside him. Behind his face, which even in the bad paintings of the time resembles no other, and his words, which were multitudinous and of a fantastical and agitated turn, there was no more than a slight chill, a dream someone had failed to dream. At first he thought that everyone was like him, but to the surprise and bewilderment of an acquaintance to whom he began to describe that hollowness showed him his error, and also let him know, forever after, that an individual ought not to differ from its species. He thought at one point that books might hold some remedy for his condition, and so he learned the little Latin and less Greek that a contemporary would later mention. But then he reflected that what he was looking for might be found in the performance of an elemental ritual of humanity, and so he allowed himself to be initiated by Anne Hathaway one long evening in June. At 20-something, he went off to London. Instinctively, he had already trained himself to the habit of feigning that he was somebody, so that his nobodiness might not be discovered. In London, he found the calling he had been predestined to. He became an actor, that person who stands up on a stage and plays at being another person, for an audience of people who play at taking him for that person. The work of a thespian held out a remarkable happiness to him, the first, perhaps, that he had ever known. But when the last line was delivered, and the last dead man applauded off the stage, the hated taste of unreality would assail him. He would cease being Ferrex or Tamerlane, and return to being nobody. Haunted, hounded, he began imagining other heroes, other tragic fables. Thus, while his body, in whorehouses and taverns around London, lived its life as a body, the soul that lived inside it would be Caesar, who ignores the admonition of the Sibyl, and Juliet, who hates the lark, and Macbeth, who speaks on the moor with the witches, who were also the Fates, the three weird sisters. No one was as many men as that man whose repertoire, like that of the Egyptian Proteus, was all the appearances of being. From time to time, he would leave a confession in one corner or another of the work, certain that it would not be deciphered. Richard says that inside himself he plays the part of many, And Iago says, with curious words, I am not what I am. The fundamental identity of living, dreaming, and performing inspired him to famous passages. For 20 years he inhabited that guided and directed hallucination, but one morning he was so overwhelmed with the surfeit and horror of being so many kings that die by the sword, and so many unrequited lovers who come together and separate and melodiously expire. That very day he decided to sell his theater. Within a week he'd returned to his birthplace, where he recovered the trees and the river of his childhood, and did not associate them with those others, fabled with mythological allusion and Latin words that his muse had celebrated. He had to be somebody. He became a retired businessman who had made a fortune and had an interest in loans, lawsuits, and petty usury. It was in that role that he dictated the arid last will and testament that we know today, from which he deliberately banished every trace of sentiment or literature. Friends from London would visit his retreat, and he would once again play the role of the poet for them. History adds that before or after he died, he discovered himself standing before God, and said to him, I, who have been so many men in vain, wish to be one, to be myself. God's voice answered him out of a whirlwind, I, too, am not I. I dreamed the world, as you, Shakespeare, dreamed your own work. And among the forms of my dream are you, who, like me, are many, and yet no one. All right. There's two lines in that just like haunt my whole life. It's the idea that an actor is a person who pretends to be another person in front of an audience of people who pretend to take him for that person, right? The idea that the actor's pretending, but so is the audience. I find that fascinating that everybody's pretending at the same time is how that works. And the other thing is the fundamental identity of living, dreaming, and performing. That they're the same thing, living, dreaming, and performing. This is something that has fascinated me for years and is why I'm interested in the filmmaker David Lynch, because I think David Lynch, who appears to be nothing like Shakespeare, has that in common with him, which is he sees the fundamental identity of living, dreaming, and performing. Anyway, that was a nice little short story about Shakespeare, so okay, looking good.